Kia ora, my name's Lockie Patterson, and this is a slightly longer video than what I've done so far, and it's got quite a bit of history in it. We go out to Maitāpapa and to Taieri Ferry, which are out in East Taieri. A lot of people probably don't know where they are, so watch this and learn some more. Kia ora. So where are these places? They're actually not too far from Henley, which is just off the section of flood-free north of Waihola. And we can see from this map that the yellow line marks where most of the Henley houses are alongside the Taieri River. This merges in with the Waipori River, which then heads out to sea. On older maps, that part, where they join up, is often still called the Taieri River, which is why where it meets the sea is called Taieri Mouth, not Waipori Mouth. So it can be either Taieri or Waipori depending on the map you're looking at. Okay, let's get going. We're on the flood-free on State Highway 1. We've crossed over the bridge over the Taieri, and we come to a point where the Berwick-Henley Road crosses it. We can see that if you turn right, you can go to Sinclair Wetland, which is beautiful, but we're turning left first towards Henley. So the Taieri Plain has always been a productive environment, but it was transformed under colonisation from a profusion of lakes and swamps and wetlands, and it was drained and became pasture land. And despite the massive ditches, there are still lots of boggy areas and wetlands. Let's go to Henley. To be honest, there's not a lot in Henley. Some houses of variable quality on the other side of the bridge, floods occasionally, and the popular hotel burnt down in the 1980s. And there's no shops. But on a nice day, the river is particularly beautiful. There used to be a small cheese factory which opened in 1920, but it's been some time since that was operating. So basically there's three places that we're going to go to. The first one is at Maitāpapa. Then we're going to head across the bridge to Taieri Ferry, and we're going to give a bit of history on both these places, and then finally we're going to go for a drive down the Taieri Ferry Road, so downriver. So let's turn right from that Henley Bridge and head southward along the Henley Road. This used to be the old main road many years ago. And about a kilometre from Henley, there's a unprepossessing road that heads off to the right. You may wonder why we have a road here that says Māori Kaik. Kaik being the Kaitahu version of kāinga, or a village. But as we shall see, there's not really much of a village here at all. Indeed, although this is still Māori land, it is leased out with none of the original descendants living here. Yes, we actually came here last weekend, and it was really, really cold and squally, and we tried to do a bit of filming, but we were out of luck. It's only about 8 degrees right now, but it's actually a really lovely day. Nice, beautiful autumn day. I'd like to introduce Professor Angela Wanhalla, who knows a lot about this area, and we'll just ask some questions, see what comes out. Okay, Angela, why were there some Māori people living here?
Thanks, Lockie. So the area we're looking at was created out of what was called the Otago deed, or the Otago purchase, and that was signed between Ngāi Tahu leaders and representatives of New Zealand Company and the Crown. in 1844, with first settlers arriving in Dunedin in 1848. Under that deed, 3 areas were exempted from purchase, and one of those areas is the Taieri Native Reserve. And eventually, over time, a small community developed there. This area is really important because it was part of a very large wetland of lakes and amazing rivers in the inland area beyond the reserve itself. So it's a really important resource base for Ngāi Tahu. And the people of Waitako and other communities regularly migrated through the area on a seasonal basis to access resources. The Taieri people come from a range of backgrounds. The ones who eventually settled there permanently, some of them have connections to the whaling station that was on Motorata Island at the mouth of the river on the coast. And a number of whalers, like the Palmer family, for instance, were connected there. And those family members eventually moved up the river and settled on the reserve. Many of those whalers had Māori wives. Others came from down south, from connections with whaling down there as well. But many of the people who actually lived on the reserve did so from about the 1840s and 1850s. And there's quite a small community on the small flat area where the 2 rivers meet on this map that you can see. And that community eventually grew over time, so that by the 1860s there might have been about 30 or so people living there, including my great-great-great-grandparents, Robert Brown and Jane Palmer. But by the late 19th century, that community had grown to have almost 170 people who had some connection through whakapapa or lived nearby to this community. So it was quite sizable by the late 19th century and a very dynamic community. The people who lived there were mainly living off dairying on their small reserve space, but they also worked on local farms. So it's a very working class community, and they sold their milk on and made money out of really very small scale farms, or by working for other people in the area.
Cool. And so this was a mixed community of Māori and Pākehā people as well?
It was. The majority of people who lived on the reserve were Māori, often have some connection to Pākehā because they might be the descendants of whaling men who came into the southern regions in the 1830s and 1840s. So well-known names there are like the Palmers and the Browns, and they come from those antecedents from the whaling connections. But over time, you've also got Pākehā men and women who marry into this community as well. And at the urapa that's on the reserve, on the flat area, you've got Māori and Pākehā who are buried in there as well. So that just represents and I think illuminates the fact that this is a cross-cultural community of some substance by the late 19th century.
So the Pākehā settlers to Otago originally, I guess, wanted the Māori to live in these reserves, not necessarily live outside of the reserves. Is that what happened?
I don't think people were restricted to the reserves, but those ended up being the places where Māori did live. So for a long period of time with, for example, the reserve we're talking about here, the majority of people were living either on the reserve or nearby because they may have married and moved off the reserve and were living in places like Wahola or Ferry across the river, or down at Taieri Mouth, like Hannah Campbell. She was Hannah Palmer. She married a Scotsman called Peter Campbell, and they settled further down the river near the coast, but still maintained very strong connections to the families on the reserve because they didn't live that far away from each other. In modern terms, it probably seems like a long way away, but when you've got a river like that's navigable and a really like a modern, to us, we'd probably regard it as probably a difficult thing to navigate, but it was quite normal at the time to use the rivers as like roads. So people were always going up and down that river, connecting with each other and working on the river and making use of it. So people did live in that area for generations, but by the time we get to World War I and World War II, in the first half of the 20th century, families are starting to leave because the area is not economically viable for the community anymore. The land is quite swampy and it's subject to flooding quite regularly, so it's very difficult to use the land when you're subject to the tides of this river. And this is a tidal river that goes it significantly affects the livelihoods of people who live right on its edge, as these families were. And you've got people who move on into Dunedin for work on the railways, for instance. So a lot of people are leaving for economic opportunity in the first half of the 20th century.
There's no descendants there anymore, so where did they end up?
A lot of families, like mine, for instance, had strong connections to Taumatu and Canterbury, so moved there. So my great-grandparents were both born here at the reserve, and married at Mosgiel in 1900, actually settled in Taumatu and had their family there. And that's because an aunt was already living there and had lived there for some time.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, thank you. If we carry along the sealed road, we come to a bridge which takes us over the river to Taieri Ferry. It's made of concrete and steel and it's lined with wooden planks.
Hello. Hi. No, sorry.
Fine. Why would you need a ferry here?
To get stock and goods across the river is basically the reason why you'd need a ferry, because there are no roads as we have today, and the river is like a road. That's a fantastic pathway into the inland wetlands, and it enables people to move their stock up and down the river, any other goods that they're trading, and for people to go from property to property as well. And it was supported by the Otago provincial government establishing this ferry, because it was recognised that this was an important river and an important pathway into opening up economic opportunities in the inland region.
So it was started up by James Harold. Where was he from?
So James Harold is from the Orkney Islands, and he was one of a number of Orkney people who ended up settling in this area. Came to Dunedin after spending some time in Canada. So he worked in the northern Manitoba region as a fur trader, and he married a woman called Agnes there. Her name is Agnes Harold, and her father was also an Orkneyman, and her mother is believed to be of Cree ancestry, Swampy Cree ancestry. They married in 1847, I think, and a week later got on a ship out of Canada and went to the Orkney Islands, where Harold picked up his family members, and they all came out to Otago and they settled at Taieri Ferry. So they're a really interesting family with these Orkney connections, but particularly strong connections to Canada as well. James Harold was very lucky to have married Agnes, because she ran the accommodation house that looked after and provided hospitality and accommodation to those who are coming up the river and moving into the goldfields. For instance, anyone who was coming up for trade up the river.
So just like there were a number of Māori families living at Maitāpapa, there was also would have been quite a number of people living at Taieri Ferry.
Yeah, a busy little place. It had a school that the reserve children went to. Yeah, it was quite a number of families. There were stores. Yeah, there was a lot of trade going on. Very, very busy place, and the river was a very popular place for people to visit for recreational activities as well. So in the 19th century, these were really dynamic, thriving river communities. It's probably hard for us when we visit the area now to actually see that sense of that past in the landscape.
Well, thank you, Angela. I very much appreciate your input. Kia ora. So if you turn right from the bridge, you'll head back to State Highway 1 and T3, which is where this red car is coming from, but we're going to head the other way and go up Taieri Ferry Road, or rather downstream. We get to the end of the road, there's a car park there, and this is the start of the Millennium Track. Well, we've made it to the end of the track. It's 9.3 kilometres now through the narrow passageway of the river to the mouth at Taieri Mouth. So we will do that as a walk one day, but not today. Maybe in summertime. At the start of the track is a building which we thought could have been one of the original buildings from the 19th century. We managed to talk with the owner, who told us that it was Wardell's crib, built before First World War. The Wardell brothers ran a small grocery empire, starting in Dunedin and expanding into Christchurch and Wellington. This was their place to get away from it all, and they had also had a launch on which to get around. There's also a small crane here, and the owner thought this was most likely for fishermen at Taieri Mouth. They could bring their catches up river, transport them to the Tea railway station, where they could go by rail to Dunedin. When the infrastructure improved and they had a better road between Dunedin and Taieri Mouth, they didn't need to use this anymore. Okay, so here we have the very start of the track, and walking up it is very pleasant. Well, I said that I wasn't going to be going on the track, so we've just gone a little way just to see what it's like. It looks pretty easy actually, a bit up and down, but not too hard. And there's the beautiful Taieri River on its way out to the sea, which is that way. G'day, how's it going?
Oh, good.